The Bone Breakers of Palermo. In 2017, a man's body was brought into a hospital in Palermo, Sicily. On paper, it looked like the aftermath of a road accident, a Tunisian man struck by a car, dead from his injuries. But when a medical examiner opened the body for autopsy, the story fell apart. He hadn't died from a car crash. He had died of a heart attack, brought on after being beaten. He had also been given crack cocaine, apparently to dull the pain of what was being done to him. That single contradictory autopsy would eventually unravel one of the most disturbing organized fraud schemes Italian police had ever documented. A criminal enterprise built not on forged paperwork or hacked databases, but on the deliberate, calculated breaking of human limbs. This is the story of the Palermo bone-breaking gangs. To understand how this scheme worked, you have to understand what it was built to exploit: the Italian insurance system's payout structure for accident-related injuries. In the world of staged insurance fraud, most schemes rely on faked paperwork, minor collisions, or exaggerated whiplash claims. What set the Palermo gangs apart was that they skipped the faking almost entirely. The injuries were real. The pain was real. Only the accident itself was fabricated. The scheme operated on the margins of Palermo's underworld, targeting a very specific kind of victim. Police said the criminal enterprise had focused on drug addicts, alcoholics, the mentally ill, and others on the margins of society.
Society who were in financial need. These were people unlikely to be believed if they came forward, unlikely to have anyone checking on their well-being, and desperate enough to agree to almost anything for money. Victims were promised a cut of the insurance payout, but in practice took home as little as 300 euros. The insurance claims themselves, by contrast, were often worth thousands. The mechanics of the fraud were coldly organized, run less like a street hustle and more like a small, specialized business. Those involved included false witnesses who would corroborate the staged accidents, doctors who produced fraudulent medical reports, physiotherapy centers that certified treatment sessions that never actually took place, and a lawyer who handled the insurance claims themselves. Every piece of the fraud had a professional attached to it, someone whose signature or credentials gave the claim legitimacy in the eyes of an insurer. But at the center of the entire operation was the act that gave the gang its name. Victims were taken to isolated locations, apartments or warehouses, away from witnesses. There, their arms or legs would be deliberately broken to simulate the trauma of a genuine car accident. More than 50 people were allegedly taken to what investigators described as rooms of horror inside apartments or warehouses. The method itself was almost industrial in its cruelty. Sicilian gangsters used 25-kilo cast iron weights, the kind found in ordinary gyms, dropping them directly onto a victim's arm or leg. Before the weight was dropped, the limb would be immobilized. The arm or leg was held in place between blocks of cement, ensuring the impact would break the bone cleanly enough to pass as accident trauma. Pain management, if it existed at all, was minimal. Victims were anesthetized with drugs, and in some accounts, the only thing offered to numb the pain was ice. Investigators allege that a nurse working at a Palermo hospital had procured mild anesthetics from her own workplace specifically to help suppress the victim's pain during these sessions. Inside the gang's own coded language, the crime had a chilling bureaucratic simplicity. The upper and lower limbs were referred to internally as the first floor and the ground floor, as if the human body were nothing more than a building with separate levels of value, each one representing a different payout tier. Once the injury had been inflicted, the gang moved quickly to construct the fiction of an accident. Fake car accidents were staged in areas of the city that fell outside the coverage of CCTV cameras, minimizing the risk that footage might later contradict the story being sold to insurers. Gang members would then escort the injured victim to the hospital, posing as concerned family members, reinforcing the narrative before any official report was even filed. The scheme was not limited to roads. In one case that stood out even among investigators used to elaborate fraud, a fake accident was staged aboard a ferry traveling from Palermo to Genoa, with the victim claiming he had fallen down the ship's stairs. The location changed. The method of extracting a convincing injury did not. Financially, the operation was lucrative and disturbingly efficient for its organizers. Italian media reported the scheme brought in more than 2 million euros a year. Against that backdrop, the amounts paid to the victims whose bodies made the entire operation possible were almost insultingly small. A few €100 in exchange for a broken limb and a payout that, for the organizers, ran into the thousands. For a time, the scheme worked precisely because of who it targeted. The victims were, by design, people whose stories were unlikely to be scrutinized too closely, people already living outside the systems that might have otherwise protected them. But the death of the Tunisian man in 2017 introduced something the gang could not control, a body that told a story different from the one they had constructed. The autopsy findings prompted investigators to look more closely at a string of insurance claims that, on their own, might never have raised suspicion. Injuries that seemed disconnected began to form a pattern once cross-referenced. Similar locations, similar circumstances, and a recurring web of doctors, lawyers, and witnesses attached to unrelated cases. The first wave of arrests came in August of the following year, when 11 people were taken into custody for their alleged involvement in the scheme. Rather than closing the case, the arrests opened it further. 3 of those detained agreed to become state witnesses, cooperating with investigators and providing information that allowed police to expand their inquiry to roughly 250 suspects. With cooperating witnesses now inside the case, investigators turned to a more invasive form of evidence gathering: wiretaps. What they captured went beyond financial records or falsified paperwork. Electronic surveillance picked up the actual sounds of the injuries being inflicted, including the screams of victims being mutilated inside private homes and warehouses. For investigators, it was evidence that moved the case from paperwork fraud into something closer to organized torture. The scale of the operation, once fully mapped, revealed a gang that had refined its targeting over time. Around 60 individual attacks were uncovered through the wiretaps alone, and the criminals were found to have specifically preferred targeting teenage single mothers, reportedly because their circumstances allowed for larger payouts. In May of 2019, the investigation culminated in a large-scale police operation across Palermo. 34 people were arrested in connection with the scheme, a number that, combined with the earlier arrests, brought the total well past 40 individuals implicated across the 2 related gangs. The arrests spanned every layer of the operation, from the false witnesses on the ground to the doctors who filed fraudulent medical documentation and the lawyer who processed the resulting insurance claims. What makes the Palermo case difficult to categorize is exactly what made it effective for so long. It wasn't hidden behind encryption or offshore accounts. It was hidden in plain sight, disguised as the ordinary, unremarkable paperwork of car accidents, medical visits, and insurance claims, the kind of documentation processed by the thousands every year without a second glance. The gang understood that the most effective forgery isn't always digital or written. Sometimes the most convincing evidence is a body that has genuinely been broken. The case remains one of the starkest illustrations of how organized fraud can escalate when the people committing it treat human suffering as a raw material, a resource to be extracted, packaged, and sold to institutions built to trust the paperwork in front of them. It took a single anomaly, one death that refused to fit the story, to expose a system that had been quietly profiting from the deliberate injury of the most vulnerable people in the city. For those who did the physical work of breaking bones and processing false claims, the profit motive was straightforward. For the victims, many of whom were already struggling with addiction, mental illness, or poverty, the choice to participate was rarely a real choice at all. It was survival, offered to them by people who understood exactly how little they had to lose and exploited it accordingly.
The Palermo bone-breaking case closed one investigation, but it left behind
An uncomfortable question about how many similar schemes might still be operating in the space between legitimate injury claims and organized exploitation, hidden not by sophistication, but by the simple fact that no one thought to look closely enough.